thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very
You,
much for having me speak on
you've
this
had an
topic.
illustrious career as a distinguished economist and a former senior advisor on gender in the office of the managing director at the International Monetary Fund. Over 3 decades, you have led groundbreaking work on gender and macroeconomics, pioneering the IMF's first ever gender mainstreaming strategy, and conducting influential research on female leadership as well. Today, however, we want to take a deeper look at the structural issues within development organizations and the opportunities to achieve equity at the leadership level. At SRI Executive, we believe this conversation is crucial because an effective and strong international system, led by global development organizations like the IMF, must have equal representation of women in decision making spaces. So, with that as context, if I may begin, I'd love to hear a little bit about your personal journey into the space of leadership and gender equity. So, what inspired you to enter the space, and what was your journey to being at the ranks of the IMF that you were?
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to just talk about a couple of uh, incidences or experience that really impacted my life. One when I was very young, and one I was when I was much older. So I come from Bihar, uh, which is one of the most regressive states, I would say, in terms of social cultural norms. Um, But I was fortunate enough to grow up in a family, an extended family, where there was equal emphasis on education for both girls and boys. So I benefited a lot from just having that education. But as I grew up, it's very interesting. I started to realize that boys are getting the education to get great jobs and make a career for themselves. Whereas we were really being prepared in some sense uh, to find either good husbands or to be good mothers to children who we could also educate at home. And that just didn't seem right to me. So
Mhm.
it stayed with me for a long time as to why was there a difference in the way boys and girls were being treated. And I come from a family where we are just two girls. So I think that was a huge advantage because my father was very, very encouraging in terms of um, not just the education part, but also uh, having a career. Uh, and I'll tell you a really funny uh, experience where my mother was a lot more traditional minded. So when I was in college, it was interesting. I was a happy-go-lucky person, and uh, I would get by studying very little. So, having fun was like number one on my priority list, clearly. And then in my undergrad, by the time I graduated, I had not done well at all academically. And my mother said, you know what? It's time to get married. I was barely 21. And I said, I don't want to get married. And she says, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know. She said, what do you mean? You're not interested in studies. You haven't shown any inclination to work. So I told my parents, I said, give me 2 years, just 2 years to prove that I can do it. I worked my butt off. I really worked very hard. And to everybody's surprise, including myself, I got the gold medal at my master's level. And that was a huge turning point. And then I came to the US to do my PhD uh, and then just took off from there. So these are I mean, so my motivation really to do well was to break the social norms, really. Not really because I was aspiring necessarily
Yeah.
for education itself. Uh, and then let's wind forward to the IMF. And this was quite a dramatic experience. So obviously, IMF, when I joined the IMF, it was in 1989 or so. It was completely dominated by men, white men, very few professional women, and of course there were biases. There's no question. I still remember one of my first missions. One of the male members, we were in a meeting, and said, "I'd like you to carry a printing paper for me." And I said, sure. And I thought that's part of the job of being junior. It's only later I realized he thought I was a staff assistant.
Mm.
I assumed.
Mm.
And I wouldn't speak up those days in meetings because I was so
Yeah.
intimidated. Um, and then, you know, 10 years later, he was in another department and he said, Ratna, I'd really like you to come and work, and we'd work together. And I said, you want to hire me as an assistant or as a professional?
Mm.
Sorry to hear. But there was one very, very uh, interesting experience, and this takes us straight to the topic that you want to explore. Um, it was, I think it was 1998 when I was going to be leading my first mission. I won't mention the country because it's a
Yeah.
very dramatic uh, situation. And I was really excited. It just so turned out that it also was also going to be the first all women's team from the IMF going to a
Mhm.
country. And I worked really hard. And 3 days before I was going to go to this country, there was a call from the no less than the prime minister who said, I cannot accept a team which
Mm.
is a woman, led by a woman who's not even white,
Oh.
and also a team that's all women. And I can tell you, I mean, I've become much stronger over the years, but that's one of probably, I think, the only time I broke down. I went to my office and I just cried, and I understood what discrimination is about because this person had no idea about my team's capabilities, my capabilities. It was just blatant discrimination, right?
Mm.
But I have to praise the IMF.
Yeah.
Uh, the number two at that time was Stanley Fisher. He was my mentor
Mhm.
also, and he called me to his office and he said, "Ratna, I know it's a tough situation, and uh, obviously it's your decision whether you want to go in such a hostile environment or not. We'll give you more opportunities in the future. Uh, if you want to go, we will support you. But if you don't want to go, obviously, it's not going to hurt your career. There's no way." And I said, "I can you please give me 1 day to think about it?" And guess what I did? I went on this mission.
You went on the mission.
I went knowing fully well. And the mission at the end of it, they forgot whether we were men or women. The focus was on the work, right? And it was such poetic justice. It's an exaggeration. I'm sure it was not really true, but uh, Stanley Fisher, the first deputy managing director, met the prime minister 6 months later and said, "How did Ratnan do?" It was in front of me, actually. Saying, "My God, why is he this?" And he said, "I've been around for so many years, and this was the best mission in 20 years."
Wow.
Can you imagine the poetic justice? I'm sure it was not the best mission in 20 years. It was an exaggeration. But the key point really was that it went well.
Yeah.
And this is so important for serving as role models for those behind me.
Yeah.
And it stays with me. It actually strengthened me, uh, you know. So anyway, that's my journey.
That's that's incredible because it's such an inspiring moment when you had the courage to do something that you could have stepped back from, and you almost proved to the IMF and to another country leader. When you can just look beyond the differences, look beyond the skin color, the gender,
Yes. Yes.
there can be great work.
Yes. Yes.
Which leads me to the question: when we think about organizations like the IMF, multilateral, there are layers of challenges, right? You have to think about, of course, what's happening within the organization, but also then on the external front, like you said, your key stakeholders or your key counterparts are countries. Um, and of course, I remember in one interview you had said that key counterparts for you are ministers of finance,
Yes,
uh, and they're also central bank governors who are extremely powerful. They make policy for the nations.
absolutely.
But again, data says there are very few women in those ranks as well. Close to, I believe it's about 23% women in at those ranks in cabinets. How do you deal with that when you're within an organization? You're handling internal and external challenges, and what you just explained with an example of that, where so the IMF stood up for what is right. But are there other instances where you've seen this happen, and how has the IMF or other organizations you've known systematically dealt with challenges like this?
So I think the most important thing is to have the institutional support from within when you go out there and you interact with such leaders. Uh, and I recall, at much later stage when I had reached pretty senior positions, uh, the my director in monetary and capital markets uh, said that uh, I want to give you an assignment, which was to lead uh, cumulatively almost a 30% team to China to assess the financial sector. It's something that the IMF does every 5 years for systemically important countries. Uh, and it was a very daunting uh, challenge where the managing director, Christine Lagarde, was taking a keen interest also. Uh, it's not easy to deal with the Chinese authorities. And also, I was an Indian, and I said, you know what, I'm just going to take this challenge, and I've just done it. Um, and I have to tell you, it was one of the best experiences in my life. There was resistance, especially on data sharing. Uh, and slowly we just broke the barriers because the main thing that you want to impress upon the authorities is whatever we are doing is at your service. It is to help your country.
Yeah.
And there are things that we will find, which obviously we are going to report to you. I have to be true to the final report also. But
Yeah.
if you address it before the paper is published, we just give you credit. And that's what they did. There are a lot of things that we found which they addressed, which in my report I was able to say that, these are things that needed attention and they were really good at it. And I actually found that the higher up you go in the hierarchy, there are a lot more actually open to listen. It's more the junior people who are constrained because they don't know how much they should, um,
Yeah.
uh, you know, uh, share. And the funny thing is, so I'll tell you something funny also about these meetings. Um, uh, and maybe I'll send you a photograph of one of my uh,
Please.
um, the team on both sides, and I was surrounded. You know, uh, I'm 5'3", small frame. I was surrounded by tall, white, non-white men in dark suits, right? And I,
Yeah.
by the way, have after 2 years of joining the IMF, I said I am very proud of my culture, my heritage. I only wore Indian clothes at work and in all my meetings abroad with every country, every
Wow.
country. Uh, and because that's what I was comfortable with, and if I want
Yeah.
to function well, I want to be in what I'm comfortable.
Yeah.
So I would be wearing, more seemingly casual clothes, but of course, in terms of salwar kameezes, etc. Uh, and when I would go for these meetings, uh, immediately the authorities, and this is not just China, practically every country, they would reach out to them, shake the hand of first of somebody who was white and tall. you know. So I reached a point where I used to tell my colleagues, I used to say, you guys walk at the back. That's it. That's the only way it's going to work. And it was funny, but that kind of seemed to work, because
Wow.
they had to welcome the person who's coming there first, right? So, so that was really interesting. Um, but I think after the initial hesitation that
Mm.
authorities may have, uh, it really becomes like, I don't know what gender you are or I am, uh,
Yeah.
but again, the institutional support is the most important thing, especially when you're facing
Yeah.
uh, authorities.
That's that's really interesting because I think we just went into how you tackled the problem of dealing with external partners for whom you might have been not the traditional person they see on
Right.
the other side
Right.
representing the IMF, which in itself is a huge victory.
Right. Right.
You mentioned, when you entered the IMF, you were probably one of the only few women in a
Right.
professional role.
Right.
Uh, how did you find yourself moving up the ranks within the organization that I imagine wasn't used to women moving up the ranks? So, what were those challenges and how did you battle those on the way up?
Yeah, I mean, just looking back, it's amazing how many barriers one broke. I was, for example, the first woman in IMF's history to be promoted to a managerial rank in the research
Oh, wow.
department. In the research department,
Yeah. Yeah.
I was among the first non-white women to be hired in the European department, for example.
Mm.
Uh, I- so in general, I'm a very talkative person, but I still recall my first 3 years, my annual performance reviews, where it would always say things like, she's very good in her work, but she doesn't speak up in internal
Mm.
meetings.
Mm.
And I would, in those meetings, I would say, I didn't have the confidence, of course, at that time. And I wasn't sure that what I said carried weight. But I could see that a lot of people just spoke for the sake of speaking. And when I got this in for the third time in my report in writing, I just went to my boss and said, look, I interface with the authorities. Authorities have, it's worked out very well. You see, I do good work. Why is it important for me to just speak up in internal meetings just for the heck of it?
Mm.
And he said it's because uh, that's where a lot more people from other departments or senior people are, and not everybody has time to read. They want to see how you what your thoughts are, right?
Mm.
So it's interesting. I came home and I said to myself, I will at least make one point at every meeting. And that, in a way, forced me, you
Yeah.
know, so I would prepare well, of course, to make that one point.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I would do that. And
Yeah.
of course, then I became so comfortable I'd speak a lot,
Mm.
which probably wasn't great. Um, but I think that was one of the ways. We also, a group of us, five, six of us, did a lot of internal study on recruitment, promotion, um, uh, treatment of the women in terms of the pipeline. So I was one of the leaders from very early on, doing a lot of analytical work and looking
Wow.
at recruitment and promotion and separation rates also.
Mm.
Uh,
Mm.
and one of the interesting findings we found was that um, even though in their annual performance reports, women were scoring very high, they were not getting promoted. So we
Mm.
brought that to the attention. But I have to confess, the big changes came when we had the top leadership women,
Mm.
right? Christine Lagarde and
Yeah.
Christina Georgia. Christina completely changed the face of top management after she arrived. Uh, and
Wow.
so and is the institution. any worse? Of course not. I think the institution did very well under both their leadership. And sometimes I wonder, why does it have to be a woman who takes this initiative? Uh,
Yeah.
because in the experience of many men, they have found that women do really good work too, and they bring diversity of thought too, right?
And I mean, you've proven there is a business case for it as
Yeah.
well.
Yes, exactly.
Across industries, there's obviously a moral case that
Yes,
equity is just
right,
the base with which we should work, but then there's a business case that we just perform better as organizations.
right,
Um,
right, right.
Dr. Sai, you mentioned once the top leadership changes and there's diversity there, the organization changes. This leads me very well into what has been on my mind. The IMF is making progress. It has made some strides. You've had, even now, there is a managing director who's a woman. But leadership and development organizations overall still lacks gender parity.
Correct.
There's not vast data to prove it, but some data has now started coming out. And a recent study by GWL Voices in the 2024 report highlighted that only 13% of elected leaders in global multilaterals have been women since 1945. They looked at 54 organizations, out of which only 21 major multilaterals had, uh, there were 21 that had never had a female leader. On the senior management teams, the number was a bit better, which was 42%. And then in governing bodies, it dropped to 30%. So, they looked at data from 54 of the leading multilateral organizations. This is what they found. Again, I caveat that there's a dose of data, so hopefully there will be more research, and especially keeping in mind that these are the organizations that are influencing global policy. So if there isn't representation in leadership there, then of course there's not going to be representation in leadership when we think about global policy. But I bring up the data to ask you, what is it that is holding us back? So why do these gaps persist according to you? Do you think it's policy failures? Is it in just biases that have continued through the years? Do organizations need to take big and bold steps? Can you break down what's happening?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So in the initial years, I have to say, and I can speak about the IMF because we had done some studies. There weren't enough supply of women who were studying these hard topics like macro and finance, right? But over time, it was very clear that women were very much out there. Uh, the IMF did a lot of work on the recruitment side over the years. It has a DEI policy, etc. And so then we found women were being recruited, uh, many more. Um, and but then they were not getting promoted. And again, uh, to me, the more I research this topic of what holds women back, a lot of it has to do with either explicit or implicit bias, subconscious bias. Uh, I, 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 I I would say that conscious bias has really fallen in these organizations. Of course, there must be some, but it's much more unconscious bias. Um, and I can give you an example in my own experience of participating in meetings. Uh, I find that when men make a point, they are much more heard than when women make a point. I also find that women, when they go for these top management meetings, tend to start sitting at the back, whereas the men go and sit on the table. Um, and one of the things I started to do is to kind of really urge these women when they would sit at the back. I'd say, "Come and sit next to me," or whatever, things like that. And it makes these small things make a huge, huge difference. But even in my own experience, even after having built credibility, what I found was more effective is if I said on a particular issue, made a point, and I said, "Oh, X, who happens to be a guy, maybe my boss, uh, thinks this is how we should proceed. And people would hear that a lot more than if I said, this is what I think.
Mm.
And I remember my boss one time said, he said, I'm sitting in this meeting with you and you are crediting me with something that is your idea. And I said, at this point, I don't care. I just want the right thing to happen. And if your voice carries more weight, which is probably not a very good thing in the
Mm.
sense of, uh, uh, you know, uh, asserting your own space. Uh,
Yeah.
but I would do both of it to insert
Yeah.
myself. But on things that really mattered for the
Yeah.
institution, for the country, I couldn't care less who said it.
Mm. Mm.
I will voice it,
Yeah.
and you know. So that still remains, and to me, that's kind of, I would say, more subconscious bias than
Mm.
conscious bias. And it's just interesting. People are just more used to, especially in topics like finance and economics,
Yeah.
hearing men talk, men opine,
Yeah.
than women. You know,
Mm.
I'm sure even women at the top have a hard time at the very top. It, in situations like this, but it doesn't mean that you stop. You still have to do it, and you have to balance. Uh, you can't become too strident when nobody hears you either,
Yeah.
right? So there is a balance that needs to be maintained, and I'm not saying that I've achieved it, but I aspire for it.
And that's amazing. I think so much of that is the personal side of leadership, where there's so much research saying there are cases in which women are not stepping up or are subconsciously even holding themselves back. And
Right.
then there's the implicit bias on the other side. And I also think about the systems level problem, right? We've got the United Nations organization that in all its years of existence, even as it strives for equity, has not had a female leader.
Right.
So there
Right.
has to be, in addition to, women holding themselves back perhaps at some level, there has to be a systems level issue going on as well, right?
Right.
And
Right.
I wonder, what is that? What do we do to break that problem to say these are global organizations? They represent they represent a group of people that is actually 50% women.
Right. Exactly.
We make it to that stage that there can be a woman leading the United Nations and so many others of these multilateral organizations.
Uh, to me, and this is where my work has focused on. I think one has to make the economic case because
Mm.
if you just make the moral case, as you say, or the human rights case, we are in echo chambers. Uh, I think it's when societies, leaders uh, realize that the whole economy and societies are going to benefit with
Mm.
greater women's empowerment or more women in leadership positions. That is when it's going to get the real attention. And more research is showing that, including many of the work that I have
That is.
done,
Yeah.
right? And I do want to emphasize one point is uh, when I wrote the first paper on looking at financial institutions and how more gender balanced boards in banks and supervisory authorities actually lead to greater financial stability, lower non-performing loans in in banks. Uh, you know, I mean, people were questioning and saying, "Are you trying to say that women are superior?" And the answer is no. It's not that women are superior. It's just that all the talented women haven't had the opportunity because you need a balance in any senior
Yeah.
position because women and men bring diverse perspectives, different views, and uh, what you cannot substitute is the lived experience of both men and women. And
Yeah.
when you bring both together, that's how you benefit. Population, as you said, half of it is women, and you're dealing with, economies, full economies. Uh, So it's really important to make the economic and the financial case. And then of course there are many benefits, right? I mean, like you rightly said, the IFIs, um, they provide a lot of financing to developing countries, especially, and that has a huge impact on the economies, and it affects the day-to-day lives of not just men but women too.
Mhm.
Uh, and then, of course, when you have women leaders, they not only serve as role models inside these development uh, and multilateral institutions, uh, they also inspire those in the member countries when you see these women going there, right? So the trickle down effect should not be underestimated, especially of these multilaterals, and really important, uh, which is absolutely critical. You know, women get a lot of experience in organizations like the IMF and World Bank, and then with this experience and talent development, they return to their home countries and take on more leadership positions. So there are huge benefits and to uh, uh, having more women uh, leading these institutions, but also building a pipeline. That's also really important. I
Yeah.
mean, one issue we haven't talked about, which is really important, is the unequal burden that women carry on household
Yeah.
responsibilities,
Yeah.
uh, elder care, child care,
Mm-hmm.
and I recall, the governor of Ireland had one time invited me for a talk, uh, and I had given, three options. Two were totally macro finance based, and one was on gender. And said, "I want you to do the one on gender," and I was so thrilled.
Mm.
It was about women in leadership positions, and there was a big seminar of the bankers and others also. And the one thing that came out, even in that meeting, they said what would really help is more daycare centers to be able to
Mm.
know that my child is safe somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, there has to be a lot of uh, emphasis by all the countries. It's not just developing countries uh,
Mm.
to provide daycare. Uh,
Yeah.
by corporates, by government, by whoever. But also, it has to be quality daycare. Otherwise, you won't find women,
Yeah.
right? And the IMF
And I
sort of
think that's the structural support that we
Mhm.
need to plug that leaky pipeline to the top, right? Because there's only so much that can be done within an
Mhm.
organization. Um, when when we think about what does it take for women to rise to the top, I think many discussions often forget what are the surrounding factors that need to exist to support that rise, and the care economy very much falls within that.
Very
But
much.
I'm very happy to see how much discussion has started happening on the topic. And I mean, you've done so much work and research that you've put out there to support that discussion.
I actually, for the last 2 years, I was on a World Economic Forum
Mm.
task force, which was on the future of the care economy.
Care economy.
And I also learned a lot
Yeah.
about how big of a barrier it is to women's economic empowerment and how neglected it is, uh,
Mm.
relatively speaking, still everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean,
And I mean, it ties into that implicit bias that we were talking about, right? What the traditional roles that we have seen people
yes,
play,
yes.
and or almost expecting to continue seeing them play even as gender norms have started to change. So it's
But there are such good examples in the Nordic countries, right? Iceland,
hmm,
uh,
yeah,
Belgium, Holland. I mean, the Europeans have done much better in this regard than any other part of the world.
yeah. Th- This makes me think. We're talking about the rise to leadership. What did the IMF do right to have two consecutive female managing directors? Was there a structural system that allowed for that rise? The care, we were just discussing the care economy and support in that field. So what did you see as the key drivers of that happening?
Okay, so these positions are completely political, right?
Mm.
They are political. There is an implicit understanding, uh, still, which is
Yeah.
not right, but still, that these are not genuine elections.
Mm.
Basically, the top leadership at the IMF is always an European. The top
Yeah.
leadership at the World Bank is always an American.
Mm.
And there
Yeah.
have been noises, there have been attempts to break this, but it hasn't happened. It still hasn't happened.
Mm. Mm.
So, really, the credit for the choices of uh, Christine Lagarde or Christina Georgieva goes to the Europeans. And the
Mm.
Europeans we were just talking about are much more open minded and liberal than other parts of the world. And it's stunning that you see in relatively more male dominated institution, female
Yeah.
leaders, right? Uh, and there haven't been that many male leaders in these institutions. Of course, I'm also waiting for the day for a female leader you know, who's also non-white. So
Yeah. Yeah. The intersectionalities are very important too.
yeah.
uh, that's very interesting because, we
so,
think about. Sorry, go ahead.
so no, I'm sorry. If you were hoping that I would say that there's a huge structural change that happened, and that's why top leadership changed. No, that's a political decision.
Um, but do you see that generally overall within senior management there has been a change?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I see that especially under Kristalina Georgieva, who changed a lot of department heads, selected a woman, and consistently sends the message. Uh, I want to see in the shortlist at least one woman.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, yeah, this is something that is an internal practice now at the IMF for managerial positions. Uh, and if you can't, uh, uh, if people haven't applied, go reach out to them. So
Wow. Make an active effort.
yes, and I actually served on a committee for 6 years. It was called the Review Committee inside the IMF,
Mm.
which was in charge of making a list of potential managers
Mm.
for fund as a whole, not just for one
Mm.
department. And that was a very revealing experience because as that committee itself became more gender balanced, it made a huge difference. Uh, you know, one of the things yes, that reminds me, in my own experience, and I think there are studies that show that men tend to do much better at interviews than women.
Mm. Okay.
So the training of women to do good interviews is really important.
Mm.
It's really important. And so, you know, psychologically, a
Yeah.
woman may have a whole history of really top performance, but if she
Yeah.
doesn't do well at the interview, somehow that seems to carry more weight. So we pushed back on the idea of putting much less weight, especially for somebody who's already got a track record
Yeah.
uh, on the interview. Uh, and
That's.
let me tell you, even I, uh, with so much experience, uh, when I would go for interviews, even at later stages, I would really prepare for it. And people would say, I mean, why do you bother? And I said, no, there is no shortcut to preparation and hard work. So that is a given, you know. And sometimes women have to work harder,
Yeah.
and it's okay if you have to bide your time until you really reach parity, just do it, but at least get there and inspire others.
And this is so interesting because what you described says there was a political decision to place a woman at the top of a massive, hugely influential
Yes.
organization, which entirely changed the culture within the
Yes.
organization. And it sounds like that one policy that said, I want to see a woman on every shortlist, and
Mm.
then also establishing a group of people to look at, the recommendations for senior position, changed the entire senior management team to have more parity at that level, which I imagine now, as you said earlier in the discussion, has trickle down effects not just in the organization but across countries.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a little bit of a backlash from the men now. A little.
Yeah.
So, so look, I very strongly believe that top leadership matters. Whether it's a country, whether it's an organization, I see that in India now, right?
Mm.
This emphasis by the G20 uh,
Yeah.
on not just women's economic empowerment, but women led development.
Led development, yeah.
It's new. It makes a huge difference when you send such a strong signal, that it really matters. Uh,
Who's on the table?
Absolutely. I mean, to me, the signal is really an increasing recognition by the world's top leaders, the
Yeah.
G20,
Yeah.
that, if you promote full, equal, effective, meaningful participation of women in the economy as decision makers, it has multi-dimensional benefits to society.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to give you the example when I was doing this gender mainstreaming work, which is mainstreaming in the member countries, not inside the
Yeah.
institution.
Yeah.
The executive director representing Saudi Arabia uh, told me, and of course, to have this document endorsed by the board that represents the 190 countries was a lot of hard work, right? Because people have different, come from different cultural
Yeah.
backgrounds. But the Saudi executive director, when I first met him, it was during COVID, and I was so shocked, pleasantly surprised. He said, "I'll be one of your biggest champions,"
Oh,
and,
wow.
and I said, "That is amazing." And
Yeah.
we Modi pushing for women-led development, all that.
Yeah.
And I said, we need three or four such champions
Yeah.
just to take the work forward. And of course, Saudi Arabia has I mean, starting from a very low base, which they acknowledge, they are making strides, right? Female labor force participation has gone up dramatically in that
That's
country.
amazing.
And
That's
that's
amazing.
why I say top leadership matters. You can bring
Mm.
change. Yeah.
Yeah. If there is the will
Yeah.
to make it happen. As we come closer to the end of this discussion, I have just a couple of last questions.
Mm.
One quick one is, if you could change one thing about how multilaterals approach gender equity, what would that be?
You mean gender equity inside their own organization or with
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
countries? Inside.
Inside their own organizations.
Yeah. Uh, this is a very, very tough one. Um, I would say giving women more opportunities and seat at the table and very consciously hearing them out.
Hmm. Yeah. Keeping an open ear. And then switching from the organizational to the personal, what advice would you have for women who are aspiring to be in leadership positions in such organizations?
I think you have to develop a thick skin to be able to uh, forget what you heard, what snide remark or comment, and believe in yourself. It's really important, and just carry on the work. Yeah. Don't waste your energies battling. Just move on. Uh, and for me, that has been absolutely transformational. My male colleagues would tell me, they said, it's amazing. I mean, yesterday you had this incredible negative experience, and today you're like, nothing happened yesterday. I said, yes, it was yesterday. I have to look forward.
Mm.
Uh, and to me, that's part of developing this thick skin a little bit.
Yeah.
Uh, and believing in yourself. These are two things. Look, I have to also tell you that I had fantastic white male mentors. I would mention Stanley Fisher, who was the first deputy managing director, and he was many things. Uh, and Michael Musa, who was the head of research, economic counselor. And that happened very early in my career. And
Yeah.
so when other bosses would put me down later on, I would say, who are you? If these top people,
Yeah.
I'm okay, I must be okay. So
Having the right allies is important.
yeah, and it's important to have champions. So if there's another thing that you said is important, is it's important to have champions, and it's different from just being a mentor.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Sai. This has been so insightful, and thank you for being so candid and so honest with your experiences and your stories. Our effort, of course, is to use everything we learn to hopefully it'll inspire other women out there who are aspiring to such positions, and also for us to learn and put that into work when we are collaborating with organizations such as the IMF. Thank you, and I hope we'll continue to stay in touch and keep learning from your expertise.